Now, it's time for this week's Seeing It Your Way piece. And this week we had an opportunity to talk to Ronan McGuirk about his extensive experience with accessible technology and how he used his experience to get involved in some of the development going on around voice synthesis in the Irish language. Let's see this week's Seeing It Your Way. So this week on Seeing It Your Way, I'm delighted to have Ronan McGuirk with us. You're very welcome, Ronan.
Thank you very much, Jude.
So Ronan, tell us a little bit about your background.
Okay, well, at the moment I'm working in the civil service, but if I go back 2 years ago, I initially had sight problems when I was a teenager, and I got registered blind when I was 22, and my sight got particularly bad when I was in my last year at college, and I did a science degree in UCD. So I just scraped through the degree. So that's how when I initially got registered blind.
Okay, and what was the condition that you?
There's RP, which I think
okay.
many people know, retinitis pigmentosa, and the nature of it is it's gradual deterioration. And when I probably in my last year, I was really struggling to read, which is obviously not good in doing a degree. And so just after finishing up with the degree, really, I realised that I was in trouble with the sight, and I made contact with the National Council for the Blind, as it was at the time. And interesting how times have changed. But at the time, the person I met there indicated that for people with a science background, there were two kind of career choices you might think of then. And one was physiotherapy, and the other was computer programming. Now, at the time, there were no computer programmers in Ireland who were blind. So they were showing that this would be a challenge, but it might be a possibility. And I did a bit of exploring, and I found out that in order to get onto a course with the RNIB over in London, I would need to be able to read Braille at 50 words a minute. I'd need to be able to type at 25 words a minute. I'd need to be proficient with a long cane, and all of which, of course, I wasn't at the time. So I went into a serious effort to learn typing and Braille and long cane. And cut a long story short, it was maybe 2 years later I finally did the course in London, and after that I got a job in AIB as a computer programmer.
And how did you feel about the overall change? Because your life must have been kind of heading one particular direction that you had planned out a little bit to some degree, and then you're changing direction into another career path. How did that kind of affect you? How did you cope with that?
Well, I had trouble with my sight when I was a teenager, like in school even, it wasn't exactly right. And say, when I left school around that age, I realised I wouldn't be able to drive a car, for example, but I thought I could manage with other things. So I was used to the idea of the sight problem, and it was slowly getting worse. And that probably was the worst time, I would say. By the time I made my way to the NCBI, it was almost a relief, say, okay, I'm not the only person with this problem, and people know how to approach it, and so on. So it was, I would say, things took a turn for the better once I officially got registered, I would say,
Yeah, okay. So when you went on this course with the RNIB, and you mentioned there afterwards that you started working with AIB, was that quite in-depth work that you were doing?
I started off the course the RNIB did at the time. It was a 3-month course in an introduction to computer programming, and it was pitched at recent graduates. So in a way, I was the ideal kind of candidate for it. So when I started in AIB, then I started off as a bank official and started in programming. But I was part of the IT department and a programmer. Like everybody else. Now, at the time, you have to think back, this was 1980, and there was no synthetic speech at the time, there was no internet, there was no email, it was a very different world. I had to use a device called an Opticon, which is an optical tactile converter. Don't know if it's still around or not, but it was a kind of a camera thing that you ran over the page, and you felt the shape of the letters with your finger. It was very slow. It did work, but it was very slow. Like the most you could do was maybe 20 words a minute reading it,
Yes. So that was quite an adaptation in how you did that. And how were your co-workers at the time? Were they kind of very accepting of it, understood it?
I would say they were very good. Yes, a very good professional environment, a lot of cooperation and so on. I suppose initially they must have been a bit skeptical as to, is it possible to do this when you're blind? But they knew that there were blind programmers in Britain at the time. There weren't any in Ireland. So they were aware that it was something that is possible. And so, yeah, I suppose it took a while to get used to it. And then a few years later, I think it was 1983, I got my first exposure to synthetic speech, which was an IBM terminal with synthetic speech built into it. This was before PCs now, but that made a huge difference. It was an awful lot quicker. There's no doubt about it.
So tell us a bit more about the kind of progression of technology that you would have used.
Well, I started off, as I said, before the days of synthetic speech. And so I would have used a terminal, no PCs at the time, and a terminal, I'd run a camera across the screen and feel the letters on the Opticon. That was the first thing. Then moving to the terminal with built-in synthetic speech. And then it was late 80s, I think around 1986 or 87, that PCs started to come in, and I started to use a DOS-based PC with HAL was the screen reader at the time from Dolphin Systems. And that worked pretty well, actually. Then we moved then to the late 80s into the 90s, and Microsoft Windows came along, the first version of Microsoft Windows. That was a bit of a problem initially because the DOS systems were beginning to get quite good, and then Windows came along, and initially the screen readers for Windows were pretty ropey. And then we moved through the various versions of Windows. When we moved to Windows NT and I started using JAWS, that was a big improvement.
Yes.
And I remember at the time as well, Microsoft moved the Microsoft Office from, I think it was version 6 to Office 97. And there was an enormous improvement in accessibility at that time. And I began to think, actually, things are going to get really much better. But then what I found since with Microsoft releases is somewhere 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that type of thing. So, if I list I thought Windows NT was very good. We moved to Windows XP after that. I didn't think that was an improvement. Windows Vista I thought was worse. Windows 7 I thought was good. Windows 8 I didn't really like. Windows 10 I think is pretty good. So it's forwards and backwards. And same with Microsoft Office. I liked Office 97. I liked Office 2003. When they changed to the ribbon, I think that was Office 2007. I really didn't like that ribbon, and I still don't like it, I have to say. But I got used to it now,
Yes, I think that kind of caught a lot of people and made it that bit more difficult. When you had just the pure menu system, there's a kind of logic in your mind that you can work out a lot easier sometimes.
Yeah, I find that more natural to use.
Yeah.
And then I was using JAWS all along. I was working in AIB in various roles and various projects and so on. And in 2011 or thereabouts, I was in enterprise architecture, and I had to use an IT architecture website, and I found it wasn't accessible with JAWS and Internet Explorer. And I got on to the providers of the website, and they insisted that it was fully accessible. And it was a German company, and they were very insistent that it was following all of the WCAG guidelines. So I had heard of NVDA at the time, and I'd done a little bit of experimenting of it at home. I think this was 2010, I think. Anyway, I downloaded a version of NVDA with Firefox at the time, and to my surprise, that worked better than JAWS and Internet Explorer on that particular site. So that was my first notion that, gosh, maybe NVDA is going to be better than JAWS. It wasn't. At that time, NVDA was much worse than JAWS on Microsoft Office, and it couldn't do Lotus Notes at all, but it was better for me on the websites. So I used the two. I used JAWS and NVDA for, I'd say, 2 years in AIB, from maybe 2010 to 2012. I left AIB in 2012, and since then I've used NVDA exclusively. when I initially left AIB, I went to Trinity, and I was doing two things. I had a research assistant job, was looking into improving synthetic speech in Irish, and I was doing an MPhil in speech and language processing, which, you know, a master's, and I used NVDA for all of that, and that involved IT work and programming and accessing databases, and obviously Microsoft Office and an awful lot of website stuff. And it worked, you know. I didn't come across anything that I said, oh God, if I had JAWS, I could use that. I wouldn't have. So that was the first exposure to that. So really, I didn't need JAWS anymore. And then when I moved to the civil service in 2015, they were asking me when I joined what kind of software did I need, and I just said NVDA. It's free, open source, no charge, and besides, it does Irish. So that's when I moved there. Yeah. So
I was actually going to say there, you were saying about the work in the Irish language synthetic speech. How did that go? What was the kind of progression of that, if you like?
Well, originally, I'd always been interested in Irish, but there hadn't been synthetic speech, which is right problem. And when I started using NVDA in AIB in 2010, I looked at the languages that were available, and I saw to my surprise it was available in Latin. And I put up a bit of Latin text, and it read it using eSpeak. eSpeak is a robotic sounding synthesizer, but the Latin was, to my ear, it was correct Italianate pronunciation. And it struck me that, you know, obviously it's possible to do multiple languages in this. And I knew in Trinity there had been a lot of work going on an Irish language synthesizer, and they've been working for several years on it. And I said to myself, you know, I bet there wasn't 10 people working for 10 years implementing Latin on that. I bet that was some guy doing it in his attic, you know, over a 2-month project. So at that stage, I had a look at eSpeak, and I realized then that actually it might be possible myself to develop Irish on eSpeak. So I reached out to the developer. It was a free open source project, and he assisted me on understanding how eSpeak worked. And I developed the Irish language in eSpeak myself. So I think it went live in 2013. Into eSpeak, that's the system that I had used. I was in constant contact with the guys at Trinity at the time, because the ABER project there in the phonetics and speech laboratory, they were working on it, and that's why I started with them in Trinity, because I said, I figure I know how to make this work with a screen reader, and we can take it from the stage it's at, which was a very good, you know, speech from it, but it wasn't integrated with screen reading. And that was the project I worked on as a research assistant.
Interesting, yeah, very good.
So it involved testing it with Gaelscoil in it, because they would be the main users of it, obviously. And so my role was testing it and getting it to the stage that it worked with NVDA, and then doing a rollout to the Gaelscoil, and then providing technical support when they had difficulties with it. I also, at the same time, I was working with INBAF, the Irish National Braille and Alternate Formats Authority, of which NCBI is a member, and they were working on the UEB, the rollout of the Unified English Braille. But at the same time, they decided to look at the Irish Braille code, because one of the questions was, do we change the punctuation in Irish Braille to be the same as UEB? And that was the intention. But they were also going to see, were there any other revisions being needed to the Irish Braille code? So I was asked to join with the committee that was looking at that. And I realized that it would be very important to implement it technically, not just to agree the code and publish it, but to implement it technically so that it would work on a computer. So I worked on the free open source project LibLouis, which is the one that NCBI uses to display Braille in Irish. So I was able to implement the Irish Braille code, both the contracted and uncontracted, into LibLouis, so that it automatically got picked up by NVDA. So when you install NVDA now, and in fact, it's made its way out to various other devices like phones and so on now, with VoiceOver. So that's the great advantage of free open source software, that when you develop it once, it can get copied and used everywhere. So it's a great way of making accessibility for minority interests,
Yeah, brilliant. So you've been very kind of hands-on in the development of some of these things, and that's given you a fairly unique perspective, I'd say. Just from your perspective of having quite a technical background, being involved in a lot of those things, obviously the screen reader was very important to you. What other pieces of technology would you say have kind of made the biggest impact over the years?
Oh, without a doubt, the long cane. I would say, from just from a mobility point of view, I think being able to walk around confidently makes a huge difference. Yeah. That to me is big. A big technological thing. Also, of course, I use the iPhone, smartphone, which is tremendous. I mean, the thing that impressed me most about the iPhone was when it came out day one, it was accessible. It's usually such a thing with new technology. Out, it takes years of lobbying to make it accessible, So I think the the smartphone is a really fantastic thing, and there's so many apps nowadays, particularly I suppose the kind of apps I use most would have been the travelling ones, like say the Dublin Bus or the Irish Real-Time Rail, or some of the GPS apps, those kind of ones, as well, of course, as library, reading books, and radio, and there's so much available now. So versatile, aren't they? Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I think just the point you made there as well about being accessible right from the off, I think that's probably one of the reasons we kind of joke around sometimes with the Apple and Android sort of situation, but being accessible from the off won a lot of fans who probably stuck with Apple for many years, largely because of that priority on access.
Yeah, like that's why I've stuck with it. I mean, I looked at Android from every now and then, and it seems to be improving all the time. My last impression, last time I looked at it, was it's still not quite as good as the iPhone, although I could be wrong because things keep changing the whole time. So, it's an area to keep an eye on.
You're letting your preference be known, but you're doing it very diplomatically there, Ronan.
There's one big fault with the iPhone, and that's it doesn't speak Irish.
Yeah.
And
Sounds like you might have a plan to do something about that.
Yeah, it's one of the things on the list,
Yeah. That's part of the bucket list, is it?
Yeah.
Very good. So tell me something. If you were to give a little bit of advice, then obviously, like we've interviewed people with various different ranges of experience in their background as to technology, and we found that obviously technology has made a big difference whether somebody has had a background or not. But from your perspective of like having a lifetime around technology, having a good kind of in-depth understanding of it, if you were to be talking to somebody now who maybe their life has changed a little bit, maybe they're just getting used to sight loss, trying to adapt to it, is there any kind of advice, any tips that you would give them?
Oh dear, now there's a question. well, actually, no. There's one thing I would say. I think two heads are always better than one. And one huge benefit to me in the 1980s was when I got together with a group of other blind people who were starting to work with computers, and we established an organization called VIX. And it was the idea that you could meet up and chat about a technical problem. I always found somebody else would have the answer if I didn't have it. And I found also that even if the other person didn't know the answer, just by me describing the problem would get it clearer in my own head, and I might suddenly get inspired as to a way around it just by chatting about it. So I would definitely say you've got to find other people who have a positive attitude and are getting out there, sorting out things, and engage with them. That'd be, I suppose, the thing I learned most. Yeah, I got terrific support and also inspiration from other people. And the other thing is, I found when I
started meeting up with blind people, first you get range of approaches, range of attitudes. Some people would say things like, "Oh, the likes of you will never get a job," you know, or "We'll never get a job," you know. And then other people you'd find who were working away on something and were confident they were going to get somewhere. I was always drawn to the more confident or more positive outlook type people. So I'd say look for people who are positive and always try and chat about your technical challenges, because somebody else will have an idea. Somebody else will have come across it before.
Very good. Well, that's brilliant advice anyway, because that kind of makes any previous experience or lack of experience far less important than just being able to integrate with other people as well who can help.
It certainly would. And people sometimes say to me, look, you've worked in IT all your life, you're a complete expert. Well, that isn't really true, because even if you take one program, and I'll just give an example of Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel, I know some parts of that extremely well and would consider myself, you know, very well up on it. But I know there's other parts of that, even just that one program, that I don't know that well, and I know other people will know better. So like there's always, you can always learn in a group situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show this week. Appreciate that.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Very good. So our thanks again to Ronan McGuirk for joining us on this week's Seeing It Your Way piece.